Classic WoW was a time when things were simpler, leveling was a journey, gear upgrades were a bigger deal, and everything took a bit more time, leading to that much more satisfaction when you crossed the next big hurdle. Everything was just right. Or was it? Recently on the channel, we've talked about some of the more memorable things in Classic, such as the opening of AQ40 or the PvP system, and today I thought it might be fun to remember some of the more, how can I put it, painful things about this version of the game. Stuff you can look back at and say, oh yeah, that was the thing, wasn't it? And don't get me wrong, each of these in their own way added to the game and made it what it was, and some people will prefer Classic because of these gameplay differences, not in spite of them. Classic had so many unique, fun interactions and features which set it apart from any other version of World of Warcraft, but on the other hand, it could certainly create scenarios that brought out the worst in people, or just naturally seemed to cause problems. Between loot, PvP, guilds, and player-made drama, this has to be the worst of Classic WoW. Speaking of the worst things to happen, you know those spam texts and emails that you keep on getting? Well, with 68% more data breaches in 2021 compared to the year before, it's not about to improve anytime soon. But Incogni has the solution. Data brokers are aggregating your personal information and selling it on to unknown businesses for their own benefit. Now, the good news here is, as an individual, you have the right to request the deletion of this data from brokers. The bad news is they're going to make this as long-winded as possible because your details are their paycheck. This is where Incogni comes in. It's as simple as signing up, informing them whose data they will be removing, granting the right to work on your behalf, and then you can kick back and wait for the results. They'll know where to look and how to handle the inevitable objections. You can even try free for 30 days too, so there's really nothing to lose. Keep your online anonymity the way it should be. Go to incogni.com/WillE to check them out. The first 100 people to sign up also get 20% off using the link below. Many thanks to Incogni for the sponsor today. Back to WoW. So let's see, where can we start on things from Classic which were more than just a bit inconvenient? How about this little addition called spell batching, a phrase that will cause nightmares for even the most dedicated Classic player. This was a feature that was brought back to WoW Classic right at its inception. The idea behind it was to handle server-side resolution of spells more closely to what would have been the case in actual vanilla, therefore creating a more faithful representation of the game and emulating it as if we all had really bad internet. Instead of the server handling each spell the moment they were fired off, it would instead do them in batches, hence the name spell batching. This batch occurred every 400 milliseconds, so in other words, the game was running as if you were on 400 ping all of the time. Now, the positive upside of this, if you can call it that, is that certain spell interactions present in vanilla would be there in Classic, such as two mages polymorphing each other at the same time, or two warriors charging each other, and just a whole host of other random weird interactions. In reality, looking back, it was bad, like really bad. The warrior mains out there will remember pressing execute, having your rage bar go to 0, and then the mob dies before the spell is processed on the batch window and you do no damage. The same with taunting mobs, it was just very slow. Playing Alliance at the time, it was not uncommon to throw Blessing of Protection on someone and another paladin would do the same, and they would end up with several forbearance at the same time. And of course, everyone's blessing went on cooldown too. But the worst experience had to be for healers. You just couldn't reliably play a clutch healer. The amount of times I pressed lay on hands or went to heal somebody, went to 0 mana, and the spell never landed and they died was just so many, and it was so frustrating. This was the same experience for any healer. Finally, in patch 1.13.7, which was a few months after Next Remus came out in Classic, more or less in preparation for TBC by this point in time, Blizzard changed the spell batching formula, moving it from a forced 400 milliseconds to resolving as fast as it could, or by at least 10 milliseconds. Even for the seasonal servers for Classic, Blizzard decided not to bring this interaction back. Either way, spell batching was certainly an experience, and just thankfully not one we have to deal with anymore. Here's another lovely feature of Classic, which I'm more than glad is in the past: debuff caps. So you know how in Wrath and, well, in TBC for that matter, you just used all of your abilities, your damage over time effects and so on that your class had access to? Well, in Classic, you couldn't. Anything that went above the cap would push off an older and often more valuable debuff from a boss. They were categorized too into major debuffs such as Sunder Armor. These were the big actively applied ones that benefited the whole raid. Medium, such as Corruption from Warlocks. These are often actively applied but only a personal DPS gain. And minor debuffs such as Deep Wounds, which were passively applied DPS gains. In original vanilla, the debuff cap was 8. Now, hypothetically, one Shadow Priest to DPS in any capacity needed at least 3 debuff slots, 4 if they wanted to use Vampiric Touch, and you could have up to 40 players in a raid. I think you can see how this had the potential to be a little bit problematic. Thankfully, in patch 1.7, that's CG, Blizzard doubled the debuff cap up to 16, which was a lot more forgiving, and when we launched with Classic, we had this same level of cap in place. All of the same, it was not uncommon to have a raid sheet prior to even stepping into a 40-man raid with the debuffs which you are allowed to do. Let me tell you right now, Serpent Sting? Nope. Moonfire? No. Devouring Plague? No. Any minor damage over time effect? Basically no. Debuff slots were all taken up by the big effects that buff the whole raid, not personal DPS gains. Eventually, Blizzard raised the debuff cap to 44 TBC, which functionally removed it, and then went on to literally remove it for Wrath. But yeah, in vanilla, you really weren't able to make the most of your class's full toolkit just because of this limitation. Speaking of debuff caps, why not move on to class balance, a term that I use very loosely for Classic, because it wasn't balanced at all, not even remotely close, in fact. I suppose this is a side effect of releasing on last patch and then not changing classes at all ever afterwards, but there was such a big difference between the top and bottom damage dealers in Classic. Here, for example, is the last 2 weeks of 90th percentile passes for Wrath Classic. There's definitely some winners in this list, and it's important to realise there will always be winners, but the majority of classes at least have one fairly solid specialisation, and if we scroll down and look at the number of passes per class and specialisation too, I think there's a good overall representation. People are playing a bit of everything, and the majority of classes are seeing value. Here's 2 weeks of Nax 40 back in Classics, 90th percentile passes again. A bit of a different story, isn't it? With one class being so clearly ahead, you'd wonder why on earth anyone would play anything else. And looking at the volume of passes per class and spec, it's a similar story too. For every Shaman DPS, Druid DPS, Priest DPS, and Paladin DPS, that's nearly half the classes in the game by the way, there were nearly 15 warrior DPS. I don't think people were playing Classic for its stellar reputation for class balance, but looking back, I've never seen such a clear divide between the top and the bottom. But now we have our force lag, our inability to cast spells because our raid leader won't let you, and a class that's literally doing about 1/3 of the damage of the warrior that dinged last week. We now need to pick up some sweet loot so we can press Starfire rank 5 for about 40 seconds before going Fortunately, you don't have to wait till level cap for problems on loot. No, the developers have put a lot of thought into this. You'll be getting a first-hand experience on how loot will go the moment you accept that one quest in the Barrens that has you collect Zevra hooves from the apparently unhooved Zevras in the area. It's common for Classic, just because you can see the item you need on the ground doesn't mean it's gonna drop. I mean, looking back at this quest, there's comments back from original vanilla on how bad the drop rate was. Here's another good one, this one's for the Alliance, Farron's Proof. You know the quest in South Shore that has you go collect Murloc heads from nearby? This one always feels like more of a grind than it should be. Oh, and how about Fiery Blaze Enchantments? That quest in the Badlands where you have to kill the whelps and drakes over on the east side of the zone for the heart. I remember very well spending nearly 45 minutes on this once, and I just eventually didn't leave until I got the drop. But eventually you get through questing and hit level cap. Now this is where the real loot drama begins. I mean, where do we even start here? The infamous hunter memes from back in the day where they would roll on anything and everything because, I mean, hunters could equip practically anything and everything, bar plate armor and maces for some reason. In practice for Classic, it wasn't the hunters that wanted everything, it was warriors. Leather for DPS, plate for tank, resistance sets for certain fights, physical mitigation sets for others, you need your PvP set, one-handed weapons for fury, two-handed for arms, shield for tanking. Oh, and that healer gear? Yep, believe it or not, I also need that for my diamond flask snapshot. A warrior could legitimately have dozens and dozens of items in their bag and find a use for all of them. And that is kind of cool actually. But what about the fact your raid had 40 people and bosses dropped a handful of items, half of which were comically bad bad and were literally on permanent disenchant status. Oh boy, another Shadow Strike. Straight into the bin where it belongs. In fact, most classes wanted the same items too. There were just so many pieces which stood out clearly above others. Mage Blade, Talisman of Ephemeral Power, Quick Strike Ring, Onslaught Girdle, to name just a few from Molten Core alone. And every guild had an item that just didn't drop for you. I'm not even talking about bindings here either. I think between Blackwing Lair launch and AQ40 doing 2 raids a week, the guild I was with at the time saw a grand total of 2 mind-quickening gems. Every single mage wanted this item for PvP and PvE. It was so good it was still used in TBC. On the other hand, I believe we saw about 7 chromatically tempered swords in a row, which led to a lot of happy warriors and rogues about that bit of RNG. And not getting the item you want to drop is definitely still a thing in Wrath for sure. Malagos just refuses to drop anything which isn't absolutely garbage, but when you have 40 players, it's just a little bit more noticeable as all. Oh, and final point on loot, in case you had forgotten, vanilla had no tier tokens either, so you knew when you killed Rag or Nefarian or any end boss, they always dropped some nice druid tier for you, and the one druid in your raid got kitted out super fast. Next, something I actually quite enjoyed. So for learning professions beyond Journeyman, you had to go to a specific trainer somewhere in the world. Now, some of them weren't too badly placed. Expert Enchanting for Horde, for example, was in the Stone Talon Mountains, and for Alliance it was just outside of Stormwind. For the most part, it was a quick Google, and it takes a couple of minutes to get wherever you need to be. There was one big exception for a trainer who was just so far away from anything else that it was kinda just annoying to have to go there. Do you remember where you needed to go to train Artisan Enchanting? Keep in mind that during Wrath you can just train new profession skill-ups from any trainer. In Classic though, you had to go find Anora, who is of course located in the Badlands, just outside of the entrance to Alderman, as in she's inside of the dungeon exterior, but not in the actual dungeon of Alderman itself, if that makes sense. I guess back in the day this was found and shared by complete luck, but you clear this random pack of scorpions and she will appear just behind you. This kind of made it somewhat inconvenient to do on a lower level, though you did have to be at least level 35 to advance to the artisan level of a profession, but otherwise you had to go and fight your way through to get to this point. And unless you had prepared materials to level up as you were there, you were gonna need to make multiple trips here too. I mean, I get it, having trainers out in the world who are the only ones to advance you to the highest tier of a profession is cool and all, but Anora, could you just, you know, leave the Scorpion Pit when we find you for the first time maybe? Would that make sense at all? Let's move on though, because as things tend to be, the real worst stuff wasn't just the minor inconveniences of the game or things taking a little longer than maybe they could have. The real best of Classic, and often the worst, were the people on the server where you were playing. Now, people definitely bang on about server reputation and community back from vanilla, and I think mileage on that statement varies a lot from realm to realm, but what was true for certain is that other players could have a much greater degree of impact on other people's games. For the better, or in many cases, the worse. When the PvP system released in Classic WoW without Battlegrounds present, players took to farming honor from lower level characters out in the world, and on some servers even resorted to ganking inside of the opposite faction's capital cities because of how fast player numbers dropped in response to the relentless ganking. And when Battlegrounds were released, they wouldn't even prove a reprieve, as pre-mades of fully geared and prepared players would crush pugs in a matter of minutes to min-max their honor gains. And don't even get me started on how CC chains worked in vanilla. What are they capped at now, about 8 or 10 seconds maximum thereabouts? Well, in vanilla, sometimes you get hit by a polymorph and you just sat there doing nothing for 30 seconds straight, and then it gets recast again and you're sitting there for another 10 seconds. You can see why caps eventually got put on these things. Being CC'd for as long as a trash mob isn't too fun on the receiving end. But the cause of often the most drama had to be from world buffs. I'm not going to go over all the effort it took to assemble them here. I did do a video on it a little while ago though, so you can check that out if you wanted some more info. Suffice to say, raiding as a whole was shaped around collecting these buffs that made you do a ton more damage. And for the majority of Classic, you really did have to play around them. During the final patch, the same one as where they removed spell batching, Blizzard would go to introduce the Chronoboon Displacer. This would absorb your world buffs, pausing their timers and storing them to use at a later date. This meant you could you know, play your class up until raid time, not have to worry about people who would hide characters around the world and try and dispel your buffs. More worrying is that people spent their time doing this, to be honest, and have everything ready for raiding when you stepped inside of an instance. When I think about this and look back to world buffs, it makes me realize I really don't miss them. Not only due to the whole factor of having to go and collect them, but what they meant for raiding. You can't have a decent progression fight alongside players potentially being 30% more or less powerful, and as great as the Chrono Boon was, it wouldn't change that either. Still, this is something, one of many things, which sets Classic apart from any other version of World of Warcraft, and many players do prefer this version of raiding, or at least a version of raiding with the Chrono Boon Displacer. Who knows, maybe Season of Mastery 2 will answer this demand. There are even a few more things I could have covered here. The one-button rotations, Biss from world bosses and having to camp them, the list very much could go on. And despite all this, despite it being called the worst of Classic, I still like Vanilla as a game a lot. It definitely has a ton of janky things, which by modern standards just wouldn't work in other games, let's be honest. But it's also proven to be a little more than just a bit of nostalgia. There's something in Classic which realizes that maybe it's not always correct to sacrifice something that's good to try and make it perfect. That's about everything I've got for today. If there's anything else you think I should have included, do let me know down below. Maybe I can do a follow-up. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in. I'll see you on the next one very soon.